I guess I'm wearing two hats, or half a hat on each side of my head. I want to talk, I've got probably too much to say, so I'll try to sort of condense it a little bit. I want to argue that last year, 2011, was a turning point in something I'll call an international but not a global crisis of social justice. That it was caused by the hardships and inequalities intensified by the financial crisis of 2007-2008. And I also want to narrate with pictures, and that's the main reason I'm using PowerPoint today, quite quickly the emergence of a wave of protests internationally that began in North Africa and that then simultaneously spread to Europe and North America. I want to explain why it's not a coincidence that the Occupy Wall Street movement started in New York City. I want to examine this movement in particular and the initiatives arising out of it with regard to legislation, unions, and ideas about a new multilateralism that sort of reflect its demands or strident lack of demands, its perspectives on policy and also on the state. And then finally, I want to look at the potential for linkages in areas of common ground with traditional social change agents such as trade unions, civil society organizations, and political parties, and ask whether there's a possibility for partnership. So the narrative begins. When 25-year-old Tunisian street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire on December 17th to protest the harassment and humiliation inflicted on him by municipal officials and the police, I don't think any of us could have foreseen the explosion of social protest that happened. These events overthrew repressive governments in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and Libya. There were civil uprisings in Bahrain and Syria still going on, major protests in Algeria, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, Oman. There were demonstrations in Lebanon, in Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and the Western Sahara, and elsewhere. Even the Palestine 194 movement in the UN to gain, for the Palestinian National Authority to gain UN's membership for the state of Palestine is in some sense a part of this movement. It wasn't confined to the Arab world. In many ways, there's a precedent in Iran's 2009 Green Revolution movement and antecedents, important antecedents in Europe and North America, including the Indignados movement in Portugal and Greece and Spain, and the Occupy Wall Street movement in the US. Two slides with words. So why was 2011 the turning point? I'm going to argue that although the international financial system experienced a profound shock in 2007, when the subprime mortgage crisis developed into a financial sector crisis, it didn't become a full-blown global economic crisis until 2008, when the US government was compelled to take control of its mortgage finance-related government-sponsored enterprises. IndyMac, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac. This year also saw investment banks Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers collapse, along with Washington Mutual Bank and the multinational insurance company AIG, which was taken over by the US government. And during the same period in the UK, we saw Northern Rock, the first large British bank to experience a bank run in something like 150 years, was also taken over by the government, as was the mortgage lender Bradford and Bingley. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. In addition, global concern among policymakers led to the expansion of the G20 in November 2008, so that not only finance ministers and central bankers, but also heads of state were beginning to meet. Their November 15th, 2008 declaration stated that the global cooperation and a commitment to market principles, open trade and investment, excuse me, and effectively regulated financial markets were seen as the key to economic growth, employment, and poverty reduction. But by mid-2009, the G20 government's subsequent coordinated interventions had largely resolved the interbank crisis, and the stimulus policies they'd adopted to boost aggregate demand were being cooperatively pursued. And in addition, the financial institutions in the US considered too big to fail had been bailed out, And in just one quarter, profitability had been restored to the financial sector, 1 quarter of negative profits as of fourth quarter of 2008. So, although the financial system recovered in 2009, at least by the measure of restored profitability, the credit crisis persisted. Lending to non-financial entities remained extremely sluggish, and despite these policies to stimulate aggregate demand, ordinary citizens in the US, the UK, and Europe continue to experience falling incomes, unemployment, increased poverty and inequality, foreclosures, homelessness, and other effects of the crisis. So that by June of 2010, when the G20 met in Toronto, it had split, with most of the G7 countries deciding to adopt austerity policies to shore up their sovereign debts and falling revenues. And on top of the original crisis, this was threatening trade and economic growth worldwide. So, as a consequence, a wide group of people in all of these countries was subjected to a crisis resolution that favored the narrow private interests of the financial sector and high-income earners in all sectors. Citizens in the most economically advanced countries were compelled, in a sense, to pay twice. First, toward the direct costs of the bailout, and then with economic slowdown and the pain of fiscal austerity. In sum, by late 2010, the banking crisis had become a generalized fiscal crisis, compounded by just a dramatic failure of accountability on the part of advanced governments and the financial sector, whose leaders all failed to grasp the injustice of saving banks at the expense of people and the health of the global economy. So, I won't go in, I did in the paper, but I won't go into the ILO's World of Work report, which I think is very important in showing a number of things. The social unrest index, I think I'll just note to say that in the Arab region and the advanced economies, the risk of social unrest seems to be rising more than elsewhere. One thing that I found very interesting about the report as well, this is the last thing I'll say about it, is that although social unrest has historically been understood in terms of civil wars and their root causes, it points out that recent literature show other factors emerging as determining unrest and the new forms that it can take. And these became the rule rather than the exception in 2011. These factors include things like income inequality, the perception of injustice, fiscal consolidation and budget cuts, higher food prices, the heavy-handedness of the state, the presence of an educated but dissatisfied population, and the presence of mass and social media, which were instrumental in organizing protests. In the Arab region in particular, just a few figures about unemployment. The world's highest rates of unemployment, including for people with graduate degrees, average rate of employment almost 15%. In Tunisia, dramatic rise in unemployment during the period of Ben Ali's taking power, very high female unemployment rates, and very high youth unemployment rates. So in the background, leading up to the Arab Spring, was the so-called Green Revolution movement in Iran, which sprang up in 2009 after the regime in Tehran overturned or suppressed election results that would have gone against the ruling cadres. Millions of Iranians, including youth, women, educated professionals, and others protested for several weeks. Also, in the 5 weeks between Mohammad Bouazizi's immolation and the January 25th Day of Rage in Tahrir Square, the Qatari news outlet Al Jazeera and social media of all kinds became critical conduits for information about protests and platforms for calls to participate. Even Secretary of State Hillary Clinton testified before the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and she said, I quote, "Viewership of Al Jazeera is going up in the United States because it is real news. You may not agree with it, but you feel like you're getting real news around the clock instead of a million commercials and, you know, arguments between talking heads and the kind of stuff that we do on our news that is not providing information to us, let alone foreigners," unquote. So the social networks certainly fostered the spread of protest between Bouazizi's December 17th immolation and his death on January 4th. The World Bank's index of internet usage shows that more than 35% of Tunisians have internet access, and more than 25% of Egyptians. So just as Tunisia's revolution had its spark in Mohamed Bouazizi, Egypt had its own sparks. One was Asma Mahfouz, one of the founders of the April 6th youth movement, which formed to support textile workers in the Nile Delta and began organizing mass demonstrations as far back as 2008 in response to election fraud, to demand higher wages and under pressures due to the economic crisis. Another spark was Wael Ghonim, who created a website called We Are All Khalid Said. Khalid Said was an unemployed or underemployed 28-year-old who was brutally beaten to death in Cairo, rather in Alexandria, for his exposure of police corruption. And concurrent with these revolutions in North Africa unfolding in late 2010 and early 2011, anti-austerity protesters unified under the name Uncut in both the US and UK began occupying the storefronts of banks and multinational corporations accused of tax avoidance and bad corporate citizenship. In the UK, the corporate targets included Vodafone, and also implicated were the policies of Prime Minister David Cameron's Big Society initiative, which wanted to replace services formerly provided by the government with volunteerism. In the US, the main corporate target was Bank of America, which paid no taxes in either 2009 or 2010. And these protests also criticized the increased political influence afforded corporations by Citizens United, which was hiding behind the poster there. Yeah. This is yeah. So Citizens United basically allowed unlimited donations on the part of corporations to spending in political campaigns. Citizens United was also implicated in an important protest that took place in the capital city of the state of Wisconsin when the governor attempted to strip collective bargaining rights from public sector workers in that state. Between the 14th and 20th of February, these protests grew from a few thousand to over 100,000 as protesters occupied the state capitol building. In the spring, on May 15th, tens of thousands marched to Madrid's Puerta del Sol, along with tens of thousands more in dozens of other cities. Frustrated with an unemployment rate of over 20%, a lack of opportunity and political deadlock, these indignados turned a one-day march into a 3-week-long self-governing occupation. And the occupation of public space, I want to point out at this point, which all these pictures show, has become one of the defining characteristics of this new global protest movement. So 10 days after these protests began in Madrid, they cropped up in Spain as well. The first week, about 100,000 Athenians went into the streets. By the second week, there were 500,000 as the protests coalesced in the occupation of Syntagma Square, and Greece's sovereign debt crisis dragged on. After Greece, there were encampments that began in other cities throughout Israel and different places. The reasons given had become familiar by this point. Not enough good jobs, high cost of living, a corrupt political system, and only the rich getting richer. Then in early July in New York City, there was a 3-week occupation on the streets near City Hall known as Bloombergville. That's the upper left slide, named after our billionaire mayor, Michael Bloomberg. Bloombergville pulled together activists from the Uncut movement who'd been occupying banks since January, homeless advocates whose actions involved sleeping on the streets, and unions and community groups who protested threatened public sector layoffs and austerity measures proposed in the city's $66 billion budget, which had seen steady increases in its overall size and amounts, but much more of it allocated to debt servicing as the years went by. So the protests involved here called for higher taxes and cuts in subsidies to the big banks and financial institutions that are headquartered in the city. And these activists, now joined by others from Spain, Egypt, and throughout the US, and by that I mean in New York City, continued to meet throughout July and August, holding general assemblies that have come to define the Occupy Wall Street movement, and agreeing to their formulation as the 99% against the 1% in the middle of August. There were other signs of spreading international protest in August when London police shot and killed a young black man that they were arresting in Tottenham. Riots subsequently broke out all over England, and according to a recently released study called Reading the Riots, which is a joint program of the Guardian newspaper and the London School of Economics, which is trying to do a consistent sociological study of the causes of the riots, these rioters must also be seen as protesters motivated by anger at poverty, unemployment, inequality, and violent police tactics. So there's a consistency there with what we've seen prior to this in the year. So if one begins to connect the dots between these different events, one sees links that are both direct and indirect. In Egypt, a flagrantly fraudulent national election and police violence. In Tunisia, brutality at the hands of the state following years of unemployment. Troubled economies battered by the global economic downturn, rising unemployment, by the elites, corrupt political elites, and banks and bankers. In the US, the catalyst was economic problems related directly to the 2008 crisis, a sluggish jobless recovery, and greater public awareness of a risk-prone, high-volume, and opaque financial system. Added to that, there was gridlock in the US Congress, which was unable to take decisions in August on raising the debt ceiling, perceptions that the political system was broken, the refusal of political leaders at the local, state, and national levels to consider raising taxes of any kind on corporations and high-income earners. All of these contributed to Occupy Wall Street's backlash. So basically, these people are looking for a new social contract among ordinary people with themselves. And I just want to play very briefly to give you a sense for the kind of Luddite communication tool which has become emblematic of the Occupy Wall Street movement. It's called a people's mic. And here there's a little video of a 4-part people's mic. Whoops. Okay.
Let's practice the people's mic, and some signals.
Okay, we're not going to see it. So, I won't do that. On to the Occupy movement and its relationship to demands and public policy. It's no coincidence that the movement emerged in New York City. The city is home to the headquarters of a number of the institutions that were directly involved in the financial crisis and its resolution, including AIG, Bear Stearns, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, MetLife, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where the open market operations to stabilize the international and national financial systems were conducted in 2007 and 2008. By the spring of 2011 in New York, the international and national dimensions of the crisis had suffused the climate of local politics and focused on an annual ritual of struggle over the city's budget. The budget battle was being presented by the mayor, and threatened were public facility closures, layoffs of city workers, and cutbacks to service agencies that were dependent on funds from the city, all during a time when the amount of the budget devoted to debt servicing was rising. So the budget under debate included not a single proposal for tax increases, and in a departure from previous year's budget battles, which had become a political ritual in the city, the usual coalition of labor unions, service agencies, nonprofits, and liberal think tanks that were unified in 2011 as the May 12th Coalition for a big demonstration organized on that day, were joined for the first time by activists organized horizontally through the Uncut movement in the new coalitions in New York's less affluent neighborhoods that were organizing people's town halls and so-called action assemblies. These were a direct attack on the town halls organized by politicians, which were seen as just public relations events for them to pick who they wanted to speak and the issues that they wanted to speak about. The demands of this group were laid out in a manifesto entitled It's Payback Time, which was prepared largely by the Fiscal Policy Institute, Good Jobs New York, and the Center for Working Families, which are all liberal public policy think tanks. They crafted a set of subsidy, taxation, and legal reforms that were designed to bring about $1.5 billion for that year back into the city budget and to rein in the socially destructive behavior of the 6 largest banks doing business in the city. So these reforms included eliminating over $1 billion of subsidies, tax credits, and low-cost energy deals to JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley, and were demanding something like $300 million in concessions and clawbacks for missed job targets. So the report in the coalition highlighted the fact that New York City is the inequality capital of the United States. And this claim was substantiated by the Fiscal Policy Institute, which published a report called Grow Together or Pull Apart in late December 2010, showing, well, they used the work of Piketty and Sayers, who attributed the sharp rise in US inequality after the 3-decade boom following the Second World War to political decisions that altered the direct taxation of wealth and income. So what the Fiscal Policy Institute did was to use fiscal data from the state of New York and the city of New York to show that New York State is the most polarized among the 50 states, and that New York City is both more polarized than the state overall and also the most polarized among the 25 largest cities in the United States. Moreover, other parts of the report showed that top income earners in the city pay a substantially smaller share of their income in taxes than the other New Yorkers. And the idea that was advanced by the coalition was that inequality was the key problem faced by the city after 2008, and that it was not the inevitable outcome of markets, but rather a policy choice regarding the institutional framework within which those markets operated. And this was what determined the distribution and concentration of wealth. The message being pushed was that inequality could be managed downward with the right demands and a strong coalition of political partners backed by a strong citizens movement, and this was the message promoted by the leaders of May 12th. Coalition partners used to this annual ritual were not surprised when both sides made concessions. The mayor always demands cuts that he intends to give back, and the other partners fall off when their own demands are met. But the activists who were initially attracted to the campaign from Uncut and the people's town halls were frankly very alienated by this political process that they were new to. And from their perspective, the unions, the city-funded agencies, and the other big players in the coalition were too quick to back away from their demands, and therefore they were seen as being complicit in an outcome that remained socially unjust because it failed to really address the challenge of managing growing inequality in the city. So directly addressing this perspective is an essay by University of Berkeley philosopher Judith Butler, and this is called So What Are the Demands? And this is in a publication put out by one of the working groups of Occupy Wall Street in a publication called Tidal. The idea is that What Are the Demands is based on a presumption that to be legitimately political, a movement has to have both a list of demands and demands that can be satisfied. Now, the General Assembly has a vast number of working groups. I've had a number of people ask, isn't the Occupy movement suppressed? It's not in the streets right now, but it's meeting every day. Hundreds of activists in New York City are meeting every day in all kinds of spaces in different working groups. One of the working groups that was active in the fall was a demands working group. It discussed a variety of demands and even sought to have some of them, such as a full job or a full employment for all demand, ratified by the General Assembly. But this proved ultimately impossible for them. Some of the demands pursued, which Butler refers to in this essay, are central to the concerns of the movement. These are demands like decreasing unemployment, repudiating student and other debt, stopping foreclosures. But what she points out is that these demands, however worthy they are, and however much effort people put into them, doesn't explain how they're all related. And the movement of the 99% against the 1% reveals that such demands only address facets of inequality. And since the central concern of the movement is to draw attention to and resist rising inequalities of wealth, it can't really count as one demand among many. What is central to the movement is a kind of overarching critique based on a claim about how the whole political economy of capitalism works at this time. So with regard to the Bloombergville activists, the point at which they saw city agencies and unions backing off their overarching demand to make the big banks and millionaires pay, and instead cutting deals to satisfy their own constituencies' narrow interests, was the point at which they began to make direct contact with indignados from Spain and Greece who were in New York City. And there were a lot of people who went back and forth over the summer, continued to meet in New York in the general assemblies that had become the kind of the nucleus of organizing of the movement, and that ultimately led to Occupy Wall Street in the fall.
Sarah, I think we've got a problem because you're not very far into your paper yet, and it's half an hour's already gone. Can you summarize somehow?
I will summarize. So what I'm trying to do ultimately in this paper is ask whether there are potential linkages and common ground, and I will quickly go through 3 initiatives that have traction in the movement. These are the NEED Act, which is by U.S. Congressperson Dennis Kucinich, the National Emergency and Employment Defense Act, the National Nurses Campaign for a Financial Transaction Tax, and a Commons Coalition of Occupy Wall Street. The NEED Act basically emerged in 2009, 2010 to address the sluggish recovery and public anger at the lack of accountability that is the public perception about the Federal Reserve's actions. The political objective of the act was to democratize the Federal Reserve by making it accountable to Congress. This was supposed to have 3 primary outcomes: to place the Federal Reserve inside the Treasury and to make it into a monetary authority, to restrict its emergency powers as a lender of last resort and make those accountable to a 2/3 vote of Congress and approval of an emergency board, including the president, the leaders of both parties, and the heads of all the major committees in Congress. It was also intended to, depending on how you read it, either abolish fractional banking or require 100% reserves. So this is a very eclectic and set of supporters, from unions which have endorsed it to the Libertarian U.S. presidential candidate, Ron Paul. But what's important to understand about this initiative is it's not a piece of legislation designed to be enacted into law, but instead to provoke public debate about the democracy and accountability of the Federal Reserve Bank. And this is the source of its populist appeal. Certainly the state of the U.S. political system, with its inability to reach decisions, gives one pause as to whether it would be wise to put such decisions in the hands of a Congress which can't take decisions. But the public debate that this has provoked, and there's really a lot of traction for this within the Occupy movement, it points to a great educational need and a thirst to understand, how we can restrict these institutions that seem to be out of control. So this is the kind of discussion that could be engaged with as part of an effort to find common ground. Interest in the Act relates to questions about how key institutions operate in national and global economies. A list of questions that I think come up from the Occupy movement are, what should be the core business of a banking system that operates for people's real needs? What's required politically to shrink the banking sector and make the economy less risk-driven? How should banks be governed and made transparent and accountable? What's the role of civil society, trade unions, and social movements in a banking system whose mission is social inclusion? How can banks be better socialized or embedded in society? These are all questions that have come up from the Alternative Banking Group and others, other working groups within the occupation. National Nurses United has a Tax Wall Street to Heal America campaign. The relationship between trade unions and the Occupy movement has been very complicated, because not only are a number of people who are involved in the movement in trade unions, but trade unions have come out at points when the occupations were in danger of being cleared, and brought out many members. So their ability to protect these nascent forms of organization were seen as instrumental. But nevertheless, there's a distrust. There was an incident where trade unions participated in a large demonstration in support of the occupation, but the union leaders arranged with the police to be arrested and then released immediately. And so this was seen as, again, a kind of being complicit with the authorities in a way that complicated the balance of trust and fear of co-optation that's been characteristic of the relationship between the Occupy movement and organized labor. The National Nurses Union seems to be doing it differently. There's a link to Bloombergville because the nurses staged a large demonstration and brought nurses from all over the world to New York and the steps of Federal Hall in June. They converged unexpectedly with the Bloombergville occupation and invited speakers from Bloombergville to put on nurses' uniforms and to speak at their rally. And I think their identification of the callous and risky behavior of finance with an illness that's affecting the country and the world, which the nurses say makes it impossible for them to serve their patients, makes it impossible for them to do their work, gives them a kind of credibility that some of the other unions have not enjoyed. They're adhering to an overarching message, which is the point that Judith Butler was making, that emphasizes the illness of inequality and the need for a radically transformative strategy. They've steered a politically difficult path because they have kept close to the Occupy movement while at the same time working with more traditional advocacy organizations campaigning for a Robin Hood tax in Europe and going to protests at the G20 and G8. And I think, I'm going to quote briefly the political director of NNU on the nurses' vision for transformation. He said, "We demand systemic and not just incremental change. We demand social justice for all, not just for a single group. We don't cut funds for this or that. We demand health care for all."
Could you sum up in one sentence, in 1 minute? So we can have time for at least a little discussion and then the other papers.
Well, unfortunately, I'll skip the part about multilateralism and the commons. I think
your paper has attracted quite an attention. Quite a lot of people have already read it, actually. So, from that point of view,
okay. Well, this is something very new for me. I mean, as I said, I'm wearing two hats, and I'm trying to do something with this paper that I think I really welcome your feedback. But in conclusion. What I want to emphasize is that standard explanations are not satisfying this movement, just as the movement is not satisfying the request to produce demands, because it's searching for something else. It's in a period of strategizing about where it's going, about figuring out how to self-organize without the influence of other bodies. And one of the primary things I would say is really required for the movement is something that's not a standard explanation for how to fix the financial system. So explanations that talk about the explosion of financialization is simply a result of something gone a little bit wrong, finance not operating the way it is supposed to by providing funds to the real economy, which could then be reinvested, simply doesn't seem to fit the facts about how non-financial corporations were investing their own money. And so I guess in conclusion, I invite your questions, and what I'd like to say is that many have, certainly in the US, have wanted to attach themselves to this movement, especially when it was making the news all the time. Even Obama is bringing up the message of the 99% against the 1%. But I think finding real partnership in the movement, it requires showing a greater transparency of leadership and the ability on the part of traditional organizations to engage in, I guess, what we might call the public use of reason.
Okay.